Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro FinSimple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
At Evernorth Health Services, we believe costs shouldn't get in the way of life-changing care, and we're doing everything in our power to make it possible. Behavioral health solutions that also keep your projections at their best? It's possible. Pharmacy benefits that benefit your bottom line? It's possible. Complex specialty care that cares about your ROI? It's possible. Because we're already doing it. All while saving businesses billions. That's Wonder made possible. Learn more at evernorth.com/wonder.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosha Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I'm with Kristen Ostrom, the executive director of Oregon Rural Action, and Caleb Lay, the director of policy and research for the organization. Oregon Rural Action is a grassroots, community-led nonprofit that works to promote social justice, economic sustainability, and environmental stewardship in Eastern Oregon. And we're going to talk today about a very serious and challenging environmental justice issue that's affecting thousands of people in our state. Groundwater in Eastern Oregon is contaminated with nitrates, and that's a problem because people in that region rely on their wells for their drinking water and other needs. And state regulators have known about this contamination for more than 3 decades. Yes, you have heard that correctly, more than 30 years. So we're going to talk about where this contamination comes from, why it's taken this long to address it and to rein in the pollution. And also we'll talk about the bigger issue, why access to water, a basic human right, is being denied to so many people in our state. Pretty big topics. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Kristen and Caleb. Thank you so for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. So let's briefly go over the basics for listeners who may not know much about this story. What is nitrate contamination and where does it come from in Eastern Oregon?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So nitrate is a chemical, very basically. You find it in a lot of different things. You can find it in explosives, fertilizers, human and animal waste, wastewater. But in the lower Umatilla Basin, it predominantly comes from 3 major sources. The first is large-scale industrial agriculture. We're talking farming on the scale of thousands or tens of thousands of acres, and all the fertilizer that goes into that. The second is industrial wastewater, primarily from food processors who process all the food that comes off of those farms, turn it into the products we see in the freezer aisle. The quarter of the world's frozen potato products actually come from the Pacific Northwest. So there is a lot of industry in the area producing wastewater that then goes back out to those fields. The third major source is confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, dairies, feedlots, things like that. Actually, one of the largest dairies in the state and in the country is in the lower Umatilla Basin, and it's set to grow substantially in the near future.
I might add that it's naturally occurring at lower levels, and it is good for plants. Plants need that nitrogen, but at higher levels, it can harm health. And the Environmental Protection Agency at this point has declared that 10 milligrams per liter is a safe level. Though there are studies that are showing that even at lower levels, it can cause harm.
And generally, agencies will say that nitrate doesn't occur naturally at more than 2 or 3 milligrams per liter, which is 2 or 3 drops from an eyedropper in 10 gallons. But in the lower Umatilla Basin, we've seen tests come back in domestic wells in the last year at over 94 parts per million, and in some monitoring wells at 113. So the contamination there is obviously very, very severe, and the health implications for the people who live there and rely on that groundwater have been extreme.
Wow. When did local residents first discover that their well water was contaminated? And also, when did the state first become aware of this problem?
It's a good question. So the state has known about the problem, as you mentioned in the introduction, for 34 years. when the state did some sampling in the 1980s, and then in 1989 passed the Groundwater Protection Act and declared this area a groundwater management area. And they've been monitoring the wells ever since then, and monitoring the nitrate levels going up. They did not, however, tell people with wells to watch out for the water or to get their wells tested. And so it was not until the spring of 2022 when our small organization joined with Morrow County Public Health to do some domestic well testing in the area. And we tested the first 100 wells. The majority of them came back very high in nitrates. We went door to door as a small organization with one member of the Morrow County Public Health to those first 100 doors, got those wells tested, and then delivered the results back to people on their doorsteps. And people were very surprised that their water was contaminated with nitrates and that could harm their health. I remember some folks just being really, really shocked. Some folks kind of knew, they kind of had heard that the water was not good. And so a lot of people were boiling the water. Boiling the water actually makes the problem worse. It concentrates the nitrate. But you would just kind of assume that it's kind of an intuitive thing. Well, if you hear the water's not good, I should boil the water. So people were, if they had heard is not good, they were going ahead and boiling the water again, making it worse and creating greater harm. So those first 100 wells in Morrow County then led to Morrow County declaring an emergency in June of 2022. And then we continued to do some well testing through that fall. So we tested in Morrow County, then together with Morrow County Public Health, about 650 wells. And that's when people began to realize that they had been contaminated, had drinking contaminated water for some folks, up to 30 years.
Wow. So I want to clarify a couple things. So when the state started testing, you mentioned in the 80s, and then, declared this groundwater management area. What were they testing? Were they testing the wells, or were they testing something else?
So they did some broad sampling in the 1980s. The first EPA grant that was put together by a former DEQ administrator who has joined us and is standing with the community to say that the state, and in particular DEQ, needs to take this more seriously. So he had secured that first grant in the 1980s. They then put together a network of monitoring wells that included domestic wells. One of our organizers has one of those domestic wells, and so we've got 34 years worth of data on her particular well and this other network of wells. There are about 30 some of that network. And in addition, there are some monitoring wells for the permitted sources of nitrate.
Okay, so they were testing a network of monitoring wells, but they were not testing every domestic well.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so nobody had really tested them until 2 years
That's
ago.
right. And they're not all of them are tested at this point. So at in the fall of 2022, we tested about 650 some wells, and we're asking the state to continue the emergency that Morrow County had declared, and to test all of the wells, so that we, first of all, could identify all of the wells in the two counties in the area, and begin to understand the scope and extent of the problem, and then warn people that they should not be drinking the water, and especially not boiling and cooking the water.
I mean, that's incredible to me that the state would have the information that, this area is contaminated, yet not inform the residents of that.
Yeah, exactly. And we keep asking why. And just note that the state has been on notice with the EPA since January of 2020. So there are a number of organizations, environmental organizations, that petitioned the EPA saying, hey, we think we've got a groundwater problem here. The monitoring wells have been showing increasing nitrate levels in the area. We think that there's a public health risk here. And so the EPA then asked the state in 2020 to develop a plan to address the immediate health risks. The state didn't get around to submitting that plan until December 2021. Then after Morrow County declared the emergency, after those first 100 wells that we tested came out with high levels of nitrate, then the EPA sent the state another letter, July 2022, saying, yeah, you've got a broad plan here, but you haven't started that plan. And we think you need to do these 7 minimum components. to help us understand that you are timely and adequately responding to this immediate public health risk. We still do not have a plan that meets those 7 minimum components that the EPA asked the state to construct in July of 2022. I might just note that community members who are directly impacted are aware of that letter, and their interests align directly with that letter and have been asking the state since July, August of 2022 to create a plan with specific outcomes and timelines to test all the wells, and most importantly, to warn everybody, to warn their neighbors not to drink the water.
So you mentioned earlier nitrate is a naturally occurring substance that's totally natural in very small concentrations, but when it's present in higher concentrations and it's consumed over long periods, it can lead to major health issues, stomach, bladder, intestinal cancers, miscarriage, thyroid issues. There's been studies that have proven those impacts. And so, like you just mentioned, there's been scores of residents who have been drinking their water completely unaware for decades that it's contaminated. What type of stories have you heard from residents about how this has impacted them and their families and their health?
Thank you so much of that. You're right. There are stories that correlate long-term exposure to adverse health effects. So when we were delivering those results, spring of 2022 to folks on their doorsteps, I remember one woman who was 9 months pregnant, and she had been drinking the water. And one of the health concerns is miscarriages or deformities. And she just went white. Her face just went white as she realized she had been drinking this water while carrying this baby. Another woman has had 2 miscarriages that she's reported. People began to self-disclose their health concerns that were correlating right with the studies. A number of people started talking about cancers. Folks started talking about thyroid problems. You can go up and down some of these streets and some of these key neighborhoods with high levels of nitrate and point out that household has cancer, that household has thyroid, that household has had miscarriages. And so because folks were self-disclosing some of those health concerns, we asked the governor, please come out and help do a health study, help do a health assessment so we can begin to understand the impact on community members and they don't just kind of worry about it. And then other folks who still don't know that they shouldn't be drinking the water can begin to understand.
Yeah, what this could do to them.
I might also just note that as we're working with folks to help them amplify their voice and be able to get to the table in public decision making to begin to address this issue, one of our leaders died of cancer. We don't know if that's particularly related, and probably will never be able to prove it. But she was drinking the water for at least 30 years. Another one of our water leaders lost his voice box. Someone who's not a smoker, but suddenly discovered after an itchy throat that he had cancer of the throat and he had to lose his voice. So as here we are trying to amplify people's voices to be heard by decision makers, the governor, U.S. senators, the EPA, our state legislators. One of our members lost their voice, literally.
Why people haven't been told for so long. I think it's instructive to talk a little bit about who the people are who live here. The lower Umatilla Basin is not a small area, but it's very rural. Morrow County is 16,000 people in total. Many of them are low income. They don't speak English. They're Latine. They're working class. And in such a rural area, they are dependent on the sources of pollution for their income. This is the stuff of environmental justice 101. Right. It's incredibly risky for them to be speaking up like this. And even when they do, to be met with the health impacts and the pushback and the threats that they face. Their voice has always been minimized. And now that they're trying to exercise it, it's very heartening, but it's also opened them up to a lot of risk because they're challenging a system that has been built over time at their expense and for the profit of others.
Mm-hmm. And these are, we should mention, these are folks who work in the agricultural and food processing industries in Eastern Oregon. The groundwater management area also abuts the Umatilla Reservation.
Absolutely. And might just note that this is kind of democracy 101 too. When we make decisions together as a state, we create laws based on our values. We have on the books laws that want to preserve our water for all uses, including drinking water. But our state is not enforcing those laws, and additional laws may need to be created. And these community members' voices have not been heard, and they have not been at the table where decisions have been made about whether to enforce the law or not. And at this point, they're simply asking to be a part of the process to make sure that their interests can be heard. I think given the tight political and economic ties in this rural area, their voices have not been heard and represented at the state legislature in decision making and the state agencies in enforcing those laws. And so they are simply asking to be a part of the process and to have their voices and their interest in having drinking water now and having drinking water for future generations, for their children and their children's children. At this point, we're looking at profits, and we're looking at those profits quarterly as a primary value rather than that precious resource that we have, groundwater, that we need to be using in generations to come.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing this up, because I think environmental justice, it's not just about the community that gets impacted, but it's also, how we make decisions about these problems and how we solve them, and where this community's wishes are when it comes to those decisions. So I think that's pretty important to mention.
Absolutely. And I wonder if we can go there for just a minute, and in particular, the Department of Environmental Quality, which has primacy with respect to protecting our groundwater. They're the primary agency with that responsibility. And there are sources here that are permitted to pollute, but they have not necessarily enforced those permits until just recently. And even within that enforcement are continuing to allow pollution to continue, even in this precious groundwater area, and even with the ongoing information both from their own department and from the domestic wells that the nitrate levels are high. And in the last permitting process, in allowing one of the sources, the Port of Morrow, to continue to contaminate the water, particularly during winter time when the plants can't take up the nitrogen, they denied a public hearing to the community, and stated that they're going to allow this permit to be modified, allow contamination to continue, and because they were doing this because this was protecting the groundwater. We specifically asked the Department of Environmental Quality to come out and talk to the community members with high nitrate level wells to let them know that they were allowing this contamination to continue, and they denied a public hearing. But they did have a public meeting. And again, that kind of comes back to the importance of people's voices is needing to speak out, even when their employers are the ones who are doing the polluting. And so it's important for community members to be a part of the process in private conversations as well, so that there can't be retaliation and silencing of their voices.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing I just wanted to clarify. So, once somebody is aware that their well is contaminated, what does that mean for their sort of daily life? Obviously, they have to use bottled water. What else do they need to do? And how much is bottled water for like a month?
Yeah, so first, I think we should say that the program developed by OHA to help people whose wells need tested and once tested are contaminated is chock full of problems. People have, over the last year of this program being up and running, had bottled water arrive on their doorstep without being told that their well is contaminated. They have had to wait 7, 8, 9 months to get the results of their well test. One of our community leaders actually had his well tested in April of 2023 and did not get his results until November. So And they start with yeah.
So people live with a lot of uncertainty.
So start with the testing, and then once people do receive the test results and that their nitrate levels are high, then they can sign up for bottled water. And then they receive jugs of bottled water every couple of weeks. And those jugs are really heavy, and you have to, so for the elderly, that's difficult. And so we have to find neighbors to kind of help the elderly utilize those large jugs of water. And then how long can you keep drinking bottled water? And what's the next step? People are still unaware of what the next step is. How do we begin to look for a permanent water source for those folks?
Right. Right. And sorry to interrupt you, but can people need to cook with it as well? Can they shower in the contaminated water, or do they also need to shower in, is it different for, if they're showering their baby versus adult?
So basically they can shower with the water, just not drink or cook with the water, and definitely not boil the water. And also brushing of teeth, especially for children who could be swallowing the water.
How about washing hands?
Washing hands, okay. Yeah. So it's really about consuming the water.
Okay. So, got it. Do we actually know the extent of the contamination? How many people are impacted? So given that the state only has monitoring wells, and then has all your group and the county have tested a number of wells, but not all of them. I mean, that sounds like we don't really know.
No, we don't. And that was one of the first minimum components that the EPA required the state to do, was to do a hazard assessment. So how many wells are we talking about here? So the state had a rough estimate of 4,500 wells. Once the state Oregon Health Authority got involved and began to do some door-to-door testing, they identified about 3,300 wells, but they acknowledge that they have not identified all of the wells. That's one of the problems with the outreach effort, and also one of the problems with state government and agencies vis-a-vis rural communities. The way we did the initial outreach was door-to-door with a trusted community-based organization and trusted neighbors who could deal with some of the barriers in rural communities. Barriers of lack of internet access, no trespassing signs, dogs, and gates. And so we kind of got around some of those barriers in rural areas and were able to test a lot of wells. The state has had those barriers have gotten in the way of the state completing the hazard assessment and testing all of the wells, as well as identifying all of the people who depend on wells for their drinking water. So we don't know how many people are involved. We don't know how many people are testing high and impacted because their wells are high in nitrates. And we don't know the scope and extent of the overall problem in the whole area.
And again, I just want to remind our listeners that the state has known about this since 1990, at least, or even earlier. So more than 3 decades, and we really still don't know what the extent of the contamination is, and we really haven't begun to rein in the pollution and solve the contamination crisis. Why is that? I mean, why is it taking so long?
The other thing I would add, just to the previous question, is the state has also done a number of studies since 1990 showing that the contamination is getting more severe. More monitoring wells have shown increasing levels of nitrate than have shown decreasing. And where they're increasing significantly. We know that this is getting worse. We know that this has been getting worse for years and years. And unfortunately, in that same time, we have seen massive expansions of permitted sources. One example, in the late 90s, the Port of Morrow still had its same permit it has today. Land applied the wastewater from all the food processors, the power plant on fields so that it can be used as irrigation water. Back then, they applied that water to around 2,200 acres. Today, that number is somewhere in the 12,000 acre range. It's more than 17 and a half square miles. If you had, imagine going for a 17-mile run, taking a left, running another mile, running 17 miles back. That is the area where all of this wastewater gets applied, and that is just the one source. And the reason for that continued relentless expansion is because it's profitable.
So the polluters are the major employers of that region, and many of the people whose wells are contaminated also happen to work for them. Uh, you mentioned the farms, animal feeding operations, food processors, pastures. These are major employers and drivers of the local economy, which makes it really complicated, as you mentioned, both for people to speak up and also to find a solution to this problem that would not economically depress the region, I guess, for lack of a better phrasing.
Well, yeah, yes or no. I mean, so the sources have known this for a long time, right? But
Yeah.
not been held to account to reduce the nitrate on the ground and in the groundwater. And a number of the sources could have taken measures 10 years ago, 20 years ago, to reduce the nitrates, but did not. They're going to have to at some point. And I don't think it's kind of, either we grow food and have jobs or we don't. We need to be able to have jobs. We need to be able to grow food, but we also need to be able to reduce the amount of nitrate contamination in the area because we need to preserve the water for all of its uses, including drinking water.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about who is in charge of regulating this. You mentioned the OHA, Oregon Health Authority, is in charge of testing, but the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is, I think, the main regulator here in terms of water. And so, is it a failure of that agency to really rein in this pollution and to stop these polluters and require them to reduce the nitrate in the wastewater and manure that they spread on our
absolutely.
fields?
I think it's absolutely a failure by DEQ. Let me just give you an example. Going back to, again, the Port of Morrow, which is just one of the many sources in the area, but perhaps one of the more illustrative of this problem. This past winter, in the course of 4 months, the Port of Morrow violated its permit 881 times. And that's, in those 4 months, they were only applying wastewater for 81 days. Now that's more than 10 violations per day for 4 months straight, in an area where that over-application, where those violations of that permit have a very real and very serious effect on groundwater. That would never be allowed in a wealthy white neighborhood. But because this is happening in a rural community that's low income, Latine, predominantly non-English speaking, it's less of a priority. And that's the status quo that the EQ has been unwilling to move from. And it's the status quo that we need to break in order to actually protect people from experiencing further harm.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, they're spreading this wastewater in the winter when there's no plants in the fields to uptake this nitrogen, nitrate.
And I might add, so this is a desert. This is rural, and it's also a desert. And we've made the desert bloom and grow food, but that means it's sandy soil. And so if the plants can't take up the nitrate, it very quickly goes into the groundwater. And we've all known this. The state has known this. The sources have known this for 34 years, and continued expansion of wastewater and irrigated ag, et cetera.
Yeah. So you mentioned before that that the idea that we can both grow food and make food and have a healthy groundwater, clean groundwater, are they can coexist. I guess I want to push back on that a little bit. I mean, if these are large agribusinesses, food processing businesses that are dumping this stuff onto fields, how can this continue unabated, basically, if this is sort of basically the way that they do business to produce the food. Unless you have a major change in agricultural practices, a major change in how these food processing facilities operate, like how can this go on and fix the problem at the same
Yeah.
time?
I really don't think it's too much to ask that we be able to grow food and have a healthy economy that doesn't poison people's water. And that's the goal here. What we see in the lower Umatilla Basin right now with CAFOs and food processing wastewater is however much water you make, that's how much you throw on the fields, because what else are you going to do with it? And the balance really needs to shift there, where only so much nitrate and water is being produced as the fields can handle and the plants on those fields can handle. It's a very simple balancing of the equation. Only make so much as you can use. Only make so much as you can.
Right,
Agreed.
but that means
it
that
comes
means
back to a
reducing
fundamental
production.
shift in the way that wastewater, fertilizer, nitrate generally is regulated. And we need leadership from the top of this state. We need leadership from the governor to put to point the executive branch agencies of Oregon in the right direction, and show them that they have a mandate to protect people.
Yeah.
People over profits.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, setting enforceable and effective pollution control standards for both point and non-point sources of pollution that can prevent further contamination of the local groundwater. And I just might note that, that the nitrate is a persistent pollutant. Once it's there, it's really difficult to get it out. You've got to be flushing it out with water from the Columbia River. And so we have got to set some new standards so that we are not continuing to load the groundwater with nitrate.
Mm-hmm. And making this a problem for generations really to come.
That's right. And I might note, so we're talking about domestic wells, but the public water systems also depend on wells out here for the groundwater. And so the municipalities have put into place certain filters so that they can be cleaning the water and getting it to 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. That is required by the federal government and state government. In the public water systems, it's the domestic wells that are not regulated at all. But the public water systems, are also experiencing the same problem as the nitrates continue to go up in the groundwater for all. So it's going to continue to be a problem even for those with public water systems.
Got it. And I also just want to add that this problem is not just happening in Oregon. It's happening in many other states that have agricultural and food processing businesses where groundwater is contaminated with nitrates at levels that are way beyond federal standards. So just wanted to note that. Not unique to our state. So your organization recently sent a letter to Governor Tina Kotek requesting help with this crisis in the lower Umatilla Basin. This letter was signed by local residents, former DQ officials, and 36 organizations from around the state. Can you tell us briefly what, if anything, the governor has done thus far to address this contamination and what she can do, actually? What you'd like her to do?
Yes. So we sent this letter May 28th, and then we sent a follow-up letter June 12th because we had not heard anything from the governor. Mm-hmm. And I might note that as the governor was coming into her new administration after being elected, we immediately let her know about this particular problem and asked for her leadership immediately, and asked for her to come out and listen to community members, get to know them, see where they live, juxtaposition to the sources of nitrate. Just come out and tour the area. She finally agreed in May of last year to come out, and she did meet with the community. The community members have been hosting tours with a variety of elected leaders, starting with Senator Merkley of January of last year, and the governor in May, and then some state legislators. And the community was really thankful for the governor to come. And in this rural area is not necessarily known for being excited about Democratic governors coming out and fixing things, but they were very pleased to hear her words and to look into her eyes. And I remember one of our community members said, who I did not expect to say this at all, he said, "I believe her. I believe that she's going to bring the resources we need. I believe that she's going to help us test wells, and I believe that she's going to help us get a health assessment out here. However, the state agencies that have been tasked to, first of all, do the testing, warn people, and get people bottled water have really fallen down on the job, as Kim was mentioning earlier in our interview. We've only tested about half the wells, and there are many people who still don't know that they should be drinking the water. So that agency that's been tasked with that immediate public health response has fallen down on the job, and rural community members are terribly upset. Just this last week, we may note that we are regularly in meetings with the Oregon Health Authority, helping them know how things are working or not working, and making suggestions for how things could work. Just this last week in one of those meetings, we discovered the Oregon Health Authority finally agreed that 300 of the original wells that were tested were outside of their data. Although the community and folks locally had been saying that for over a year. So the Oregon Health Authority tasked with that immediate public health response really falling down the job, and we need the governor to really hold Oregon Health Authority accountable for that immediate public health response. Then we also need the governor's leadership on the medium-term solution to find a permanent water source, and then the long-term solution, which is to clean up the groundwater.
And just to clarify, what do you mean it was the wells were outside the data of OHA?
So we with the local public health authority, had tested about 600 of those wells. About 300 of those wells needed to be retested as the state got involved. When the state got involved, they kind of started from the beginning again and didn't incorporate those first tests. And then they finally admitted last week, we didn't incorporate those folks, and they really should get retested. But it's been almost 2 years now.
Got it. Okay. And you're hoping the governor declares a public health emergency?
So from the very beginning, as Morrow County's emergency ended in January of 2023, as the governor was coming on board, the community asked for the governor to continue that emergency, which would allow her to work with all of the different state agencies who have different pieces of the solution, to work together and to get the resources needed to very quickly finish the hazard assessment, test all the wells, warn people, and then begin to move to that, how do we get a permanent water source for these folks, and then begin to look at the long-term solutions. So we asked for her to declare that emergency from the very beginning, continuing the emergency. I might just note that the Environmental Protection Agency Region 10 Administrator Sixskiller has also declared this an emergency, and that we need to be treating it as such, especially to make sure that people are aware of the health risk and then the new resources that are now available and how to access them. So after a year that the governor is out here, we faltering on the immediate public health risk, not knowing what the next steps are to secure a public water source, let alone ongoing contamination of the area, again asking her to declare an emergency and to make good on the promises she made with the community. And the gap in time, the trust that could have been built when she was out here, the trust is now faltering, and they're just wondering, once again, they are being left out as rural communities and not being heard.
Got it. It's taking too long to come up with a solution. You mentioned the immediate needs, such as testing, and then, sort of the next step, which is a permanent water source. And then the longer term solution, how do we fix this problem? What that would be more through the regulatory system, like DEQ.
Yeah, and maybe here's where we talk about the LaGuama Committee, the Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Committee. So in 1989, the state declared this a groundwater management area, and a part of the statute is, okay, that means we have a concerted effort, both on the regulatory side and on the voluntary side, to use best practices to reduce the nitrate. And the goal of the state statute is, let's get the groundwater back to 7 milligrams per liter. So that committee is made up primarily of the sources and local county government, an environmental group, and the tribes. After Morrow County declared an emergency, DEQ reformed that committee and allowed a public health seat and gave that public health seat to us. So Oregon Rural Action serves in that seat, and then we asked for a second seat, and so there's a second public seat. And so the groundwater committee is to be addressing the long-term issues. Here's the problem.
So what if they come up with, and I guess what's the rub when the sources of pollution, the very polluters that are making things worse, are sitting on that committee task force?
That's right. What is the incentive, right? What is the incentive to change up practices? And as we talked about earlier in our conversation, we've got to be changing practices if we're going to begin to address this issue on the long term. So that's one of the problems. And the EPA had said to the state, hey, state, you have got to coordinate the governor's office, all of the state agencies, the counties, and local entities and communities all together for one overall response to be addressing the short-term, medium-term, and long-term issues. So we've been asking the state to actually follow through with what the EPA asked them to do in July and not just rely on these voluntary efforts through our groundwater management approach. We are still awaiting that action plan. We did just hear last week that the EPA is requiring the state to now submit an action plan by July 30th. But again, the counties are not involved, and the community, and most importantly, the community is not involved in helping establish that plan at this point. Again, we're asking the governor for her leadership and to really center the community in any particular action plan moving forward that has specific outcomes and a specific timeline.
Would having required actions as opposed to voluntary measures be a better approach from your perspective?
Yeah. So last summer, so we sit on the LAGWAMA committee now, Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Committee. It's a long mouthful of an acronym. We sit on that committee. Last summer, we had a day-long retreat, and we heard from another organization in Florida that has a very similar situation. And we heard that we can achieve results if we have these elements. One, we have one state agency in charge, not 4 state agencies in charge, one state agency in charge. 2, we have an enforceable plan. So whatever plan we come up with, it's enforceable, not just voluntary. And then thirdly, we have money, a lot of money to be dealing with the long-term problems.
And right now, it sounds like we don't have an enforceable plan or money or enough money.
No, we don't, and we don't have one agency involved. And we haven't really talked about, maybe here, Caleb, we talked a little bit about DEQ's role and ODA's role.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to add to this part of the conversation too. Is at the end of the day, it shouldn't fall to this committee, this Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area Committee, comprised of sources of pollution and a couple of community members, to deal with this. This is the job of the state agencies. They are regulatory agencies tasked with protecting our groundwater, with regulating agriculture to prevent contamination of groundwater. They are allowed to make rules saying you cannot do XYZ thing in this area. But they have outsourced that responsibility to the LAGWAMA committee for the past 34 years. And that cannot continue. There's no reason that the state agencies can't step in today and change the dynamic. And that, I think, is one of the major reasons that we need leadership from the top.
Got it. And I do want to add that the agricultural businesses and processors in the area have an organization called Water for Eastern Oregon. They've been expressing interest in helping in this crisis. I'm curious how the folks that you talk with have received that campaign or that those offers from the agribusinesses, the very agribusinesses that are polluting in the basin.
Well, these agribusinesses have been involved in the committee for 34 years or so. Right. So after all of these wells got tested and we've been sharing this information, community members' voices have been heard a little bit more in the media. Then they put together a 501c4 organization and a really beautiful website and are now on the Oregon Health Authority's team to share information, and are getting paid a grant, as we're understanding it, from the Oregon Health Authority to share information out with the community. I think that's I appreciate the interest. But I think we should look at outcomes and who really has the money and the power and the authority to make the significant changes that are necessary.
And we should add that these polluters are not paying for the bottled water that
That's correct.
folks are receiving.
And again, in the EPA letter to the state, July 2022, specifically asked the state to hold the sources accountable for some of the financial contributions to get people safe water, immediate bottled water, and a permanent water source. And that's yet to happen.
And some of these businesses involved in this are making literally hundreds of millions of dollars in profits per quarter. They're selling billions of dollars per year in frozen potato products. The burden of this should fall on those who have caused it, not the people who have suffered because of it. There's no reason that Oregon taxpayers should have to pay a greater share of this than the industries and the companies and the corporations responsible. That's not justice. Looks like those responsible taking responsibility and being made to take responsibility if necessary.
Yeah, and I think that's a bigger fight in the environmental justice and environmental, and climate world right now, is making polluters pay for their pollution. But that's another conversation. I want to wrap this up with just one final question, which is, in your letter to the governor, you talk about this contamination as one of the most pressing environmental justice issues in our state. Can you talk a little bit about what the response to this particular issue, this 3-decade delay in response, really, what this means about how Oregon responds to environmental justice issues and deals with this type of pollution, and sort of what it means for our state going forward, how we should address these issues, not just this particular one, but other issues that, may crop up and do crop up in Portland, Salem, other rural parts of the state. Like, are there any lessons learned in terms of environmental justice and how to address it, basically?
Well, I really do think that this would not be a problem 3 decades later if we were on the west side of the state. This is a rural community, and the votes out here, don't elect governors and a lot of the folks in the state legislature. And that's just something we just need to acknowledge. And so all the more reason we need to be sharing this information and this story with folks on the west side, because I think we as a state pride ourselves in wanting to protect our environment and in caring for people. We pride ourselves in wanting to be a leader in environmental justice. We've got an opportunity right now on this particular issue with domestic wells and large-scale agriculture. We have the opportunity to be leading the nation on this particular issue. And we also have an opportunity to be leading the nation and putting muscle on our skeleton of environmental justice principles. We say, and we passed most recently the last legislature, Environmental Justice Council. We say that we want to advance environmental justice, and we want people who are directly impacted to meaningfully be involved in public decisions. We've got an opportunity on this particular issue to really make good on that. And let's include the community in public decision-making, in public hearings, in the permitting process, and in this next stage right now on getting them a permanent water source. Who can the community be working with to figure out what that permanent water source is going to be so that they don't continue to drink bottled water forever?
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, Kristen and Caleb. This is a really important conversation, and I'll be following this topic in the future in the Oregonian and at OregonLive.com. And I'll try to drop a few links in the online post so folks can follow up if they want to read up more on this issue. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you, listeners.